Okay, here's the beginning of our lecture to replace Monday, January 23rd's lecture. For those of you who are in the 10 o'clock large class, this first slide is going to be a repeat of what we did with indentured servitude. So if you want to fast forward through this slide and the next slide, you can take up the rest of the lecture at that point. For those of you who are in the 1140 small class, this is where we will begin. So let me remind you about where we were, and then I will begin the lecture. So if you recall, we're looking at the southern colonies. We're looking at the southern colonies and looking at how economic motivations and geography shaped a distinctive culture and way of life in the South. So we've looked at certain elements of Southern society. We've looked at the cash crop economy. We've looked at the rural nature of Southern society that are two distinctive characteristics of the South that are based on the motivations of the people who arrived and the geography. So the third piece of, or the third element of the distinctiveness of Southern culture is their labor system. And you have, and it shows on the slide here, indentured servitude and slavery, the South's distinctive labor system. The South, because it's a cash crop economy, needs to have a labor system. Family labor will not be enough for people to be able to grow as much tobacco as they want, or if you're in other places, whatever cash crop it might be. And so colonists began looking for a way, especially in Virginia, to find people to bring into the colonies in order to do the labor. Colonists in Virginia knew about slavery. Slavery had existed in the Caribbean since the early 1500s, but colonists in Virginia and in the British colonies didn't have enough money to purchase slaves. They were land rich, cash poor, so they were looking for a cheap labor force. That cheap labor force came in the form of Englishmen who were poor living in England, who would have their passage paid for them in exchange for giving to a planter a certain number of years of labor. So if you were an indentured servant living in England, a planter would pay your passage to the New World, and in exchange you would sign a contract that said you would work for that person for between 3 to 7 years, and you would be provided solely with room and board. You would not be paid. Your work was how you paid off your passage to the New World. This idea of indentured servitude worked very well from the early 1600s, from about 1619 until the 1670s. Okay, so indentured servitude was the system that operated during the first period of the expansion of the cash crop economy in Virginia. So Englishmen are coming to the New World. They're serving as bonded servants to planters. What do they get in exchange? In exchange, they get passage to the New World, and the government would offer through the planters 25 acres of land to you if you survived your indenture. Okay, so what do planters get out of this? Planters get the planters get for a very cheap cost, the price of passage to the New World. In exchange for that, they get the labor of somebody who is at their mercy, that they can tell what to do, that they can have there to work for them 7 days a week, that person, and all they have to do is give them room and feed them. So that's a very cheap way of getting labor. This also, for the government's point of view, it provided immigrants, which was absolutely necessary in the South because so many people were dying of diseases that the colony doesn't grow just by having babies until the 1700s. So in order for this colony to grow, they needed people coming in, and indentured servants became the influx of immigrants through this period of time. Okay, so what I want to do very quickly is talk with you, and I'm going to talk this through with you, and you can go back and you can take a look at this slide and read through it a little more carefully. But I wanted to show you this primary source, and I'll read it quickly and then ask you to think about who might be trying to who might be the writer of this. The labor servants are put to is not so hard, nor of such continuance, as husbandmen nor handcraftsmen are kept at in England. I said little or nothing is done in winter time. None ever works before the sun rising nor after sunset. In the summer they rest, sleep, or exercise themselves during the hours of the heat of the day. Saturday afternoon is always their own. The old holidays are observed, and the Sabbath spent in good exercises. The women are not, as reported, put into the ground to work, that is, they don't work as farmers, but occupy such domestic employments as housewifery is in England, that is, dressing victuals, right up the house, milking, employed about dairies, washing, sewing, and etc. And both men and women have time of recreation as much more than in any part of the world besides. If you read this is providing a very positive view of indentured servitude. And if you guess that this might be a planter or somebody trying to advertise to indentured servants in England, you'd be right. They're making indentured servitude sound very good. Contrast this primary source of talking about how much time you have off with the following. This is a letter that comes from your textbook, actually. Martin's Hundred in Virginia, 1623. Loving and kind father and mother, my most humble duty remembered you. This is to let you understand that I, your child, am in a most heavy case by reason of the nature of the country, which is such that it causeth much sickness, as the scurvy and the bloody flux and divers other diseases, which maketh the body very poor and weak. Since I am came out of the ship, I never ate anything but peas and loblolly, that is, water gruel. A mouthful of bread for a penny loaf must serve for 4 men, which is most pitiful. We live in fear of the enemy every hour, for our plantation is very weak by reason of the death and sickness of our company. I saith that if you love me, you will redeem me suddenly, for which I do entreat and beg. Good Father, do not forget me. This is a much more typical description of what indentured servitude was like. If you are an indentured servant during these early periods, the likelihood of you surviving your indenture, that is, living through your indenture to get that 25 acres of land, was only 2 in 5. 2 of 5 people survived their indenture. That meant the other 3 died before they made it to the end. So indentured servitude was not exactly the recreation that those who were trying to advertise were. People who were in the colonies were subject to the same diseases, the hard work, and so forth that followed the people who had come there freely. But despite the struggles for indentured servants, despite the fact that people died, indentured servants continued to come because the possibility of surviving and getting land was much greater. That was such a temptation to somebody who lived in England. So indentured servants are going to continue to arrive and continue to grow the population of Virginia, and thus become the labor force that allows tobacco, the growing of tobacco, to increase enormously and the cash crop economy to survive. So this becomes a primary and very important source of labor during this period. As I said, indentured servitude lasts until the 1670s, at which point the colonists are going to transition from indentured servitude into slavery. Okay, so ignore the stuff that's down at the bottom of the screen right now. Please direct your attention to the top. The second distinctive labor system in the American South was African slavery, and this becomes the very distinctive aspect of the South. If cash crop economy is one that characterizes the South throughout the colonial period and into the existence of the United States, so too does African slavery define Southern society. African slavery is a new labor system. It's set up in the new colonies beginning in the beginning in the 1670s. The reason that colonists will turn to African slavery are twofold. Number one, indentured servants stop coming beginning in the 1660s and 1670s as new work becomes available in England. And indentured servants, people who could be indentured servants, decide it's better to stay in England than to risk it to come to the New World. So the pool of people available to come is growing smaller and smaller. And in addition, number two, planters in the colonies actually now have cash to spend on the very expensive purchase of a slave. And so colonists are beginning to look at indentured servitude as less valuable to them as the purchase through cash of a slave. Slaves began to come beginning in the 1660s and 70s, but after the 1670s, beginning, say, about 1675, the number of slaves is going to become not just a trickle, but a flood. Okay. So what is the process of becoming a slave in the American colonies? We've talked a little bit about slavery as it existed in West African society. We did that last week. We need now to explore how it is that the slavery that existed in West Africa is translated into the system of slavery here in the New World. And let's take a look at this through the experience of a person and sort of how does a person living in West Africa become a slave and end up on a Virginia plantation. Okay. It all begins with the process of being enslaved. And we'll do this by looking at something that's called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the term used to describe the process of the point of being captured to the point of arriving in the New World and becoming a slave on a plantation in Virginia. This period is called the Middle Passage, the passage between being free to being a slave. Okay. The Middle Passage has a few parts to it, and I'll show you through these pictures a little bit about this. You can read a lot more about this in Chapter 3 on pages 73 to 82. I'm going to do this a little more rapidly than I would do in class. People became slaves either by being captured in war, as was typical in West African slavery, and then the person who had captured them selling them on the coast of West Africa to slave traders. The other way that you might become slaved, and this became more and more popular, was that slave traders, if you look at the picture there on your left, this man is a slave trader, and he's checking out, he's actually licking the skin, the sweat off of a slave to see if they had diseases, because some of the diseases had a particular smell and taste in the sweat. So this is what he's doing. He's not kissing the guy, he's actually tasting the sweat to see if the person is healthy. But this is a slave trader who has gone into the interior. They have kidnapped people out of their villages. They've sneaked up on people who are alone and isolated, kidnapped them, and then placed them in long lines of slave and marched them to the sea, to the West African shore where trading posts are. At that point, the slave trader will sell the slaves to the folks who are trading with the Portuguese or the Dutch. And at that point, then, the slave pens on the coast are where you would be housed until you're sold and placed on a ship. And if you look up at the photographs on the right, or the pictures on the right, on the top is a picture of a slave ship on the surface. Down below is a very famous photograph or a drawing of how you would put slaves into a slave ship. They would be kept primarily under the decks in the cargo holds on two levels. These are the two levels that are being shown. And basically what slave traders would do once they purchased the slaves, they would do something called packing them in to put as many slaves into the cargo hold as possible in order to maximize your profit. Approximately 20% of people put into these ships died on the passage over. That was on average. On some slave ships, you could have a 50% death rate, sometimes as much as 80%. So from the slave trader's point of view, the more people you packed in, the better it was going to be. Slaves lay on board side by side, chained to each other, for approximately 6 weeks. Only periodically and only after half the passage was over, when slaves became weakened enough that there was no risk of rebellion, were slaves allowed to come up on the deck in small numbers to be, quote, exercised. And if you note up on the picture, if you look at the man who's on the left-hand side, what he has in his hand is a whip. And so the exercising was done by whipping slaves so that they would move their legs, so that their muscles would be moved. The Middle Passage was a horrific experience for somebody who has been kidnapped and placed in slavery. Slaves did not know where they were going. They had no idea what was going to happen to them. They were sick. They were kept underneath the planks in the darkness for all of these weeks. It was horrific. What would happen to you when you arrived in the New World, when you arrived in places like Williamsburg, or in later years in places like Charleston, is that you would be brought to the surface. You'd be unloaded from the ship, and within a couple of days you'd be placed in pens and then sold at auction like livestock. At that point then, whoever owned you would take you to their plantation, and you would begin the process of transitioning into slavery in the New World, having to learn how to be a slave in the New World. Okay, so that's the Middle Passage. That's the process that would bring you, if you were a slave, onto a Virginia plantation beginning in the 1670s and the 1680s. What we're going to do next is look at the population of slaves and how that changes. And before I show you a chart that's in your textbook that you can view as well, what I want to say is this, that kind of imagine 1670 on a Virginia plantation. In 1670 on a Virginia plantation, it is most likely that the people who worked for you, if you were the owner, were indentured servants. By 1705, it is most likely on that same plantation that all of your indentured servants are gone, and every person who is laboring for you is a slave. The colonies went, beginning in 1670, to having a majority of indentured servants, to by 1705, within a generation or less, to being almost completely a slave society. All the laborers being slaves. So that period of time of about 35 years is the transformation from indentured servitude as the labor force to slavery as the labor force. And from then on, Virginia planters, South Carolina planters, all the planters in the South, they're not going to look back. They are going to be committed to African slavery as their system by which they make their wealth. Okay, so what we're going to do next then is look at this chart. And I want you to view this in your textbook. It's in chapter 3 on the pages that were noted on the slide before. But if you look at particularly, look at the top chart in 1650 and look at the Chesapeake, the middle, and the Chesapeake in the lower South. You look at all of those colonies, it's almost all white. It's exclusively white. There are a few slaves that exist that are there. They are very small in number. They are very scattered. There's no sort of culture of slavery. If you look at 1700, you can see that the population of slaves in the Chesapeake region has grown from almost 0 to almost 13,000. Okay, and then if you look at 1750, at the peak of the colonial period, you can see that in the Chesapeake the numbers have grown to 150,000. In the lower South, there are 60,000 there. The numbers are just going to constantly grow from 1670 to 1700 to 1750. And that kind of gives you a sense of the regional developments there. Okay. And again, if you want to look at that more closely, you can look at it in your textbook. So the next thing that we want to look at is how does the society and the government go from a system of indentured servitude with all of the laws that said this is what an indentured servant is, to a society that has slavery, that has what we call chattel slavery. And chattel means property. That word spelled C-H-A-T-T-E-L, chattel or property slavery. So how do we do that? And what I want to talk about now really quickly here is to talk about creating slavery as a permanent institution. Okay. The institution and the legal framework that existed until 1670 in the colonies was indentured servitude. So laws were created that said this is how long an indenture would last. This is how you can treat an indentured servant. This is what happens if an indentured servant runs away and you bring them back. Okay, there were all of these legal restrictions and laws in all of the colonies in the South that defined indentured servitude. There weren't any laws that defined slavery in the colonies because slavery didn't exist as an institution. So what we're going to examine here under this heading of creating slavery as a permanent institution is what do the colonists do in the South to turn and create slavery into a legal permanent institution of the South. So what do? The first step is dehumanization. The very fact of having chattel slavery by saying a slave is a piece of property, the same as my bed, the same as my house, the same as my plow, is taking away the idea that the person that is working for you is a human being. Okay. The next step in the dehumanization is the passing of laws that say a slave is somebody who, okay, a slave is somebody who is not allowed to move about freely. So laws are passed that say slaves are required to be on the plantation. If they're off the plantation, they have to have a pass that was given by the owner that says this slave can go from this place A to this place B. And if they're not at this place A or B or on their way, then they're violating the rules. Being a slave meant you couldn't own weapons. Being a slave meant that you were subject to any kind of punishment that your owner wanted to provide on you. So there's no limitations of the punishment that an owner can give for misbehavior. Being a slave meant you had no right to control your children. Your owner owns your children. Okay? Being a slave means you're not allowed to marry. The slave owner is not required to recognize the marriage between a man and a woman. So stripping away all the things that it means to be human and turning that human into a piece of property that has economic value, but no human value, no human protections are provided to a slave. Okay, so laws are doing that. They're stripping away what it means to be human and defining a slave as an economic piece of property. Step 2, once you've created your piece of property, step 2 is the idea of permanence. Slavery in law becomes in the Spanish and especially in the Spanish Empire a permanent institution, and the colonists are going to do the same thing. They're actually going to follow what the Spanish are going to do by creating a permanent, ongoing institution. And before I explain what I mean that way, I want to start by going back to West Africa and say this. Do you recall in your mind what happened in West Africa to a slave's children? A slave's children in West Africa were free, right? The status of the mother or father did not follow to their children. This is not true with chattel slavery. To create a permanent and ongoing institution, what the colonists are going to do is they are going to pass the status of the mother to the child. So now, from mother to child, from that child to their children, the status is going to be passed on. And so once I have a slave, all of their children are going to be my slaves. They're going to be my property forever and ever with no ability to get out of it. Okay. The way that this is done, and I'm going to show you a primary source document to do this. This is an excerpt from the Virginia Slave Code of 1705. And please note, write this down and then note this. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 was the most important set of laws in the American colonies with regard to slavery. I'll say that again. It is the most important set of laws that were set up about slavery in the American colonies. The Virginia Slave Code was adopted or copied by every single colony in the Americas, in all of the 13 colonies. Slavery existed everywhere. It was used the most in the South. And the Virginia Slave Code becomes sort of the model for the way that we define slavery in the American South and in all of the American colonies. And the act that I'm going to look at, the part of the Virginia Slave Code that I've shown you here, is the one that reflects permanence. Other laws go back to step 1, dehumanization. Okay, so Act 12, Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. And what that means is it passes the status onward. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. Okay, that's the first part, and that's the key part. The second part talks about if any Christian shall commit fornication, that is, have sex, with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. Okay, so that's basically saying white people shouldn't have sex with African Americans, with slaves. But if a white man does so, his child, if that comes from him having sex with her, will be a slave because it's according to the condition of the mother. Okay? So this is going to be passed through the mother's line. If your mom is a slave, you are a slave forever and ever. And this makes this institution permanent. We'll talk later and in class about what obligations an Englishman may or may not have to his child who's a slave. He has none, but we'll talk about some of those complexities later because it's an interesting part of some of these aspects of slavery. Okay, but for now, dehumanization, the creation of a permanent institution, are part of this whole idea of this distinctive labor force that comes into existence to maintain the cash crop economy. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to look at another element of what is distinctive about the South. The South has a cash crop economy. The South is rural in nature. It has this distinctive system of labor, indentured servitude, and then slavery. And now we're going to look at what results from the institution of slavery. And we're going to call this a biracial society in the southern colonies. And again, I didn't put the page numbers, but this material is drawn from chapter 3 in the textbook. This is in the section on Africans and Europeans. So if you want to read more about this, you can read about it there. What occurs in the South when West Africans arrive to become slaves in the southern colonies and whites and African Americans begin to interact as owner and worker is that we begin to see what we call a fusion of cultures, a fusion of West African and English cultures. And this is seen in a huge variety of areas of American culture. And again, you can read some of those examples in the textbook in chapter 3, and I will expect you to do so. I'm going to talk about just a couple of elements in detail and expect that you'll be providing some other examples of that from the text. And I'm going to do this by showing you a photograph, or a painting. It's one of the very few paintings that are in existence still that demonstrate what slave life was like in African American, in the southern colonies. And if you look at this painting shows slaves on a plantation in the slave quarters. And if you look, I'm going to show you two things. Examine the dress of the people that are there. They are dressed as Europeans. They are not dressed as Africans, except if you examine the headdress. The headdress for many of them, especially the women, is typical West African style. So they're wearing European clothes, but they're maintaining the dress, the headdress that is distinctive of West Africa. The other element that I want you to look at is the musical instrument that the fellow is playing on the right. He's playing a banjo. A banjo is an instrument that comes from West Africa. If you look farther over and it shows the man that has the drum between his knees, this is a typical West African form of drum. So music is being brought as well as the maintenance of the clothing. So what you're seeing is a fusion that's taking place. That fusion is a fusion that is created in the slave culture. So slaves are becoming, sort of a fusing of West African and English culture. But that's also happening in the big house. As slaves provide the music to their white owners and incorporate West African rhythms and traditions, so too are whites developing this distinctive understanding of West African music. And that's being incorporated into a typical Southern music. Another thing that's distinctive that's not talked about in your textbook that I'll mention here is we all know the Southern drawl, right? We know how Southerners speak with a Southern drawl. And white Southerners, especially during slave times, are very proud of that Southern drawl and talked about it as their distinctive way of speaking. That distinctive way of speaking, though a white Southerner might not be willing to admit it, came from the specific accent of white Southerners and West African language. And so even the very accent that is distinctive of the white Southerner is part of this fusion of West Africa and English ways of speaking. So this is part of this fusion of cultures. If you look in your textbook, you can read about architecture, you can look more at music, you can look more at other ways that the South is becoming distinctive as West African culture is embedded into the white South and becomes part of white and African American Southern culture. Okay, so that's the fusion of cultures that exists in this biracial society. A couple of other elements of this society that are distinctive that I want to mention, and this is true for slaves and this is true for whites. The life expectancy of men and women in the South was different for Southerners than it was for people in the northern climes. Life expectancy was 45 years of age. Okay, that was very, very low. It actually was lower than if you stayed in England. The life expectancy was about 50 in England. How is this? What is the consequence of this? One of the consequences is immigrants have to continue coming into the New World. Both Africans and whites have to continue being brought in order for the population to grow. It also meant that families were made up of many, many stepmothers, stepfathers, extended families, because if somebody dies young, they're going to remarry. And you would have families, white families, that had a stepfather who might be raising children of his own and children from 2 other marriages. So it was kinship becomes very expanded as people are intermarrying because their original husbands and wives are dying. So kinship networks become hugely important. Okay. We'll talk about this also later in a little bit more detail. Okay. Finally, as we look at the Southern society, we also want to look at religion and wealth. Okay, religion and wealth were the key to status in Southern colonies. This is not going to be quite as true in other places, so this is a distinctive aspect of this new biracial society that's developing in the South. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. On the left, you see a typical 18th century, that is 1300s, Georgian plantation home. So by the 1700s, if you were a big planter, you were living in a home that was very different from those original homes we looked at when we started this section on colonial America. If you were wealthy, you were successful, you had power, you were able to do much of what you wanted to. But another thing that's important in Southern colonies, which might not get you as much status in the colony, but it was important, was your connection to your religion. If you were a member of the church, if you were a priest within the church, or you had a leadership role in the church, that was something that was really important, particularly because the Anglican Church was the church of England, and therefore that gained you access to the British government. And we'll talk about how this works in a little more detail, but I want you to write down on your notes that religion and wealth were key to success and status in southern colonies. So have that in your notes as well. Okay. Contrast that with, this is a photograph from the mid 1800s that show you a picture of slave quarters on a plantation, and you kind of get a sense. Go back and look at the plantations of. Okay, so I just messed this up. Oh, here we go. The plantations on these, the plantation home, and then contrast with the slave quarters, and you definitely have a very big difference there. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. What I wanted to do mainly was to get you the elements, and I did this a little more quickly so I could get this uploaded as quickly as I could. I want you to remember that you should have in your notes, you should have as the distinctive elements of southern colonies, a cash crop economy, rural society, the labor force of indentured servitude and slavery, and you should be clear about what those are and how those work. Okay, and then the idea of the biracial society. These are elements that are very, very distinctive about Southern culture. These are not true in other places. So these are what make it distinctive. That's what makes the South a specific region with these distinctive elements to it. Okay. Now the final thing I'm going to talk about, because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and have you write the answers down before you come to class on Wednesday, is F. And that is government in the South. Because as all of these cultural developments are distinctive, we also are going to see that the South has a distinctive type of government. Okay. The government that's created in the South is a democracy. The first legislative body of the South is a legislature where there are elected officials that come and vote for you. Think about your state legislature, or think about Congress. You elect somebody, they go to that body, they pass laws, and those are the laws that are going to bind you in the colony. Okay, so the government of the South of Virginia, and then the other colonies to follow, is a legislature. Planters, people with property, elect members, they go to the legislature, and their job is to promote the society. In the southern colonies, because they are economically motivated, this statement that I have here is what you need to focus on. The legislature is focused on promoting the economy of the South and maintaining the social status for the wealthy. So the government, the legislature of Virginia or the legislature of South Carolina, what are they going to do? They're going to pass laws that help the economy grow. So for instance, in Virginia, one of the big things every year that the legislature did was they passed a law that said, how much is a leaf of tobacco worth in trade? And the reason they did this for many years in Virginia was because if you didn't have cash, if you didn't have money, real money to spend, then what you could do is you could use the tobacco you grew as a trade item. Okay, so they needed to define how much is that worth. And so they would pass laws for that. Remember with indentured servitude, they passed laws to define what indentured servitude was. That's a necessary set of laws to help guide the creation of this institution of indentured servitude that was vital to the growing of tobacco. Okay, so what I want you to do in thinking about the passing of laws is, can you think of any other laws that I've discussed in a section that reveal the focus on promoting the economy? Okay, this is in the section that I've done today. See if you can remember what set of laws were created and how they help the economy move and help the South create its cash crop economy. So jot down at the end of your notes any answers that you have. When we come back to class on Wednesday, I'll ask you if you have any questions from this lecture. We'll go over that. We'll talk about the question that I've had to answer, and then we'll move on and begin looking at New England colonies, and we'll start to look at the region of New England and begin to contrast it with the elements that we've looked at with the South. Okay, I know this was quick. I'm doing this because I've been having problems with downloading, so I'm trying to make it a little faster so you get the information. Hopefully this will turn out and you'll be good to go, and I will see you on Wednesday. Okay, this ends the lecture. Thank you very much.